James Brown stepped out of the taxi, feeling the scorching summer air burn his face. The city was sweltering, and the asphalt seemed to radiate waves of heat. With relief, James entered the cool interior of the financial institution. He was dressed in a neatly pressed suit, carefully chosen for this meeting, one that made him feel confident and professional, ready for any business. In his hands, he carried a leather folder with important documents and a check, the reward for years of hard work on a project that had finally brought him substantial compensation. The financial institution was large and modern, with glass walls, marble floors, and light wood accents. The bank office exuded an atmosphere of precision and order, even a kind of impersonal comfort that deceptively masked the potential complexities awaiting someone beyond the door. James walked in knowing that he had a simple transaction to carry out, one he had performed countless times in his life, but this time, everything felt different. As he passed by the first rows of desks, James noticed the employees working behind them, their faces a mixture of concentration and fatigue. Some of them didn't even look up as he entered, but a few cast him piercing glances. James couldn't help but notice those looks. They were too familiar, something he had learned to recognize since childhood. Those looks were always a blend of distrust and suspicion, especially when he appeared in places like this. He made his way to the counter where a young woman named Maria was seated. Her dark hair was neatly tied back in a bun, and her face wore a polite smile, slightly tired, but still sincere. She looked up and saw James, and for a moment her smile grew warmer. James handed her the check, and she began processing it. Everything seemed completely routine, standard actions James had seen countless times before. Maria carefully entered the data into the computer, and as she worked, he stood calmly, waiting for the transaction to be completed. But within a couple of minutes, a man approached them. Richard Harrison, the bank manager, was a tall man in his early 40s, with a solid build accentuated by an expensive dark blue suit. His tie was impeccably knotted, and his hair neatly styled, a professional appearance that spoke of someone accustomed to respect and authority. Harrison's expression, however, was anything but welcoming, especially as his gaze landed on James. Harrison wasted no time. He stepped closer, glancing at Maria, and then at the check in her hands. James immediately sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The air grew tense. He noticed Harrison squint slightly, his eyes lingering on the check longer than necessary, as if searching for something to confirm his inner doubts. James felt a growing discomfort in his chest. He already knew what was coming next. Harrison motioned for Maria to stop the process. She looked confused, unsure of what to do. Her eyes briefly met James's, and in them he saw an apology. Maria seemed to understand what was happening but was powerless to change it. Richard, on the other hand, was confident and determined not to back down. James could feel the attention of everyone around him shift toward them. Several people at nearby desks looked up, watching. The situation was quickly becoming a public confrontation, and James couldn't help but feel a wave of humiliation. He had done nothing to deserve this treatment, but every glance and every movement from Richard told him otherwise. All he wanted was to deposit the check, access the money he had earned through honest work, and move on with his day. Instead, he was being scrutinized, and he understood that it wasn't about the check. Internally, James felt a familiar pain and anger. How many times had he gone through something like this? How many times had he been suspected solely because of the color of his skin? This wasn't a new situation for him, but it didn't hurt any less with each occurrence. He saw it in Harrison's eyes, the hidden yet undeniable distrust rooted in the belief that someone like him couldn't possibly possess such wealth. It didn't matter that he had worked late nights, that he had toiled to earn this check. In this man's eyes, James was already guilty. When Maria stopped the transaction and looked at James with a helpless expression, he felt his confidence begin to waver. The weight of not just this moment, but of all the times his rights had been questioned, his dignity tested, pressed down on his shoulders. He was a black man in a financial institution, and that alone was enough to make him suspicious. Richard Harrison continued examining the check with meticulous scrutiny, showing no hint of politeness or respect in his demeanor. Maria remained nearby, unsure of what to do. The surrounding staff tried to return to their work, but James could see them stealing glances out of the corners of their eyes. His presence had become an event. His simple attempt to deposit a check had turned into an issue requiring the manager's and even the security guard's involvement. James glanced at the security guard near the entrance, a young man with a serious expression. His gaze was also fixed on James, carrying a cautious, ready-to-act tension. James understood perfectly well what this meant. He was the center of attention, under close observation, forced to feel out of place in a space where everyone had the right to feel secure. When James realized that they weren't going to serve him, he sighed, suppressing the rising wave of anger. He knew that his goal wasn't to escalate the conflict right now. He turned and slowly walked out of the financial institution, feeling the stares of Richard, Maria, and the security guard on his back. He knew this wasn't the end. Within him, a resolve was already growing to prove that they were wrong, that he had every right to be there and access the same services as anyone else. The night passed, but James found no peace. The events at the financial institution continued to haunt him, lingering in his mind like an unwelcome guest. The humiliating experience seemed to stick to his consciousness, depriving him of sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Richard Harrison's face, cold, detached, and filled with distrust. James understood that it wasn't about the check, it was about the deeply rooted prejudices in this man's mind. His disrespect and doubts weren't directed at the piece of paper James wanted to deposit, but at James himself, his background, the color of his skin, and his place in society. Richard's words and actions grew in significance, becoming a symbol of all the trials James had endured throughout his life. In the end, James decided he would not back down. He knew that if he allowed Richard to continue behaving this way, people like him would never feel safe. James felt a responsibility to return, not just for himself, but for everyone who had faced similar situations, yet could not fight back. The next morning, summoning his courage, James dressed carefully, choosing an even more formal suit than the one he wore the previous day. He wanted to look impeccable, giving no one any reason to question his standing. Taking his documents and the check, James headed back to the financial institution. This time, he was resolute. He intended to complete the transaction and demand fair treatment. As James entered the office, he immediately noticed how the attention of those around him focused on him. The building seemed the same as the day before, but the atmosphere felt different. Many of the employees recognized him from the previous incident, and James could sense their eyes following his every step. These looks, a mix of curiosity, distrust, and silent judgment, trailed him like an invisible shadow. Some gazes carried a hint of sympathy, while others were openly wary. Maria was at her station behind the counter and froze slightly when she saw James. She seemed to understand internally what was about to happen and tried to remain calm. James approached her, feeling a cold tension spreading through his body. He handed her the check, and Maria, despite her visible unease, began the process, just as she had the day before. James knew Richard was there without even looking. He could feel his presence, heavy and threatening, just as he had felt it yesterday. And within moments, his suspicions were confirmed. Richard approached the counter with the same expression as before. At that moment, the tension in the room became almost tangible, as if the air had grown thicker. Richard once again took the initiative, stopping Maria and interrupting the process. James couldn't help but notice Maria's brief look of distress. She clearly didn't want to repeat yesterday's scenario. Her hands paused momentarily above the keyboard, and she glanced uncertainly at Richard before quickly complying, setting the check aside. Richard turned to James. His gaze was filled with icy arrogance. He began speaking, explaining the need for additional verification. There wasn't a shred of respect in his voice, and James felt his body tense. It was déjà vu. Everything was happening again. And once more, James found himself the center of attention, with his intentions and integrity called into question. At that moment, James glanced around and noticed the security guard. The young man stood by the door, his expression growing more serious. As he realized the situation was repeating itself, James felt the weight of that look. It was as if every move he made was being scrutinized. The guard seemed ready to intervene at any moment if something went wrong. James understood what was happening, and a storm of anger brewed inside him. He had done everything right, followed the procedures, been polite and respectful. Yet despite this, he was once again forced to prove himself. Prove that he wasn't a criminal, that he had the right to access the same services as anyone else. And he knew it wasn't about the check. It was about the color of his skin. The security guard, prompted by a nod from Richard, approached the counter. James knew that if he argued or let his frustration show even slightly, it would be used against him. He could easily be labeled as an aggressive customer who needed to be dealt with. So, he forced himself to take a deep breath, his hands unconsciously clenching into fists, but he didn't let his emotions take over. With every step toward the exit, James felt his humiliation deepen. He was being escorted out of the financial institution as if he had done something wrong, as if he didn't belong there. The people around him stared again, some with sympathy, others with surprise, and some with cold indifference. He felt the weight of their gazes, each one adding to the burden on his shoulders. Once outside the building, James paused for a moment to take a deep breath. The hot air burned his lungs as his humiliation slowly turned into anger. He knew this incident could not go unanswered. He needed to prove his point, not just for himself, but for those who had faced similar situations. A resolve began to grow within him. He would not let this go. James understood that this conflict wasn't just about him. It was a fight for respect, for the right to be treated as an equal in a society too often inclined to divide people into the worthy and the suspicious, based on prejudice. And James already knew what he would do next. After being escorted out of the financial institution again, James felt utterly drained. He sat in the car that took him home, staring out the window and trying to collect his thoughts. Anger, humiliation, and helplessness overwhelmed him. He couldn't understand why he was being treated this way when he had done everything right, simply trying to deposit his own money. The whole situation seemed absurd, yet all the more painful because he knew deep down it wasn't about the money or the check. It was about the prejudice of people like Richard. That evening, sitting in his apartment, James couldn't relax. On the table lay the check, the document that symbolized his hard work and success. But now it had become a painful reminder that his achievements were questioned solely because of his background and the color of his skin. Over and over, he replayed the events of the past 2 days in his mind, trying to figure out what he could have done differently to avoid such a situation. But he knew there was no right way. Everything he had done was perfectly normal, yet he had still been made to feel like a criminal. James decided not to sit idly by. He felt he needed support, knowing it would be difficult to achieve justice alone. He chose to reach out to his longtime friend Thomas, a lawyer with whom he had often discussed issues of justice and discrimination. Thomas was a man of strong convictions and a firm believer in the rights of every individual. He never turned a blind eye to injustice, and James knew he needed someone like that on his side right now. The next day, James met with Thomas at a small cafe where they often gathered to discuss personal and professional matters. Thomas was a tall black man with kind eyes and a confident posture. When James told him everything that had happened at the financial institution, he saw Thomas's expression darken. A familiar spark appeared in his friend's eyes, signaling his readiness to fight for justice. Thomas listened to James carefully without interrupting, then pressed his lips together and nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised by what he heard. Thomas knew that such incidents were far from rare, but whenever they happened to someone close to him, the pain felt more personal. He understood that his friend deserved respect, just like anyone else, and he couldn't allow James to be humiliated because of stereotypes and prejudice. Thomas immediately offered his help, knowing exactly what needed to be done, to hold the financial institution accountable for its actions. James felt a weight begin to lift from his shoulders. He had an ally, a person willing to fight for his rights. But beyond legal support, James knew he needed something more. He needed people to know what had happened. He needed to draw public attention to the issue, to ensure this incident wouldn't go unnoticed. Remembering his acquaintance Laura Miller, James decided to contact her as well. Laura was an independent journalist, known for her reports on social injustice and the fight against discrimination. They had met years ago at a community event, and James knew she was someone he could trust. Laura always worked to tell the stories of people whose voices were often ignored, and James was confident she could present this situation effectively. Reaching out to Laura, James arranged to meet her at her office, a small but cozy space where she worked on her articles. Laura was an energetic and confident woman, unafraid to ask tough questions or challenge powerful individuals. As James recounted his 2 visits to the financial institution, he saw her eyes widen in outrage and disbelief. She was shocked at how far prejudice could go and immediately expressed her willingness to help. Laura understood that stories like James's shouldn't remain hidden. She knew that publishing an article could draw attention to the issue and force the institution's management to take action. She asked James numerous questions, clarifying details and gathering all the necessary facts. Her professional approach gave James confidence that she could convey his story to the public in a way that no one could ignore. After meeting with Thomas and Laura, James no longer felt alone in this fight. He knew that with these people on his side, he had a real chance not only to restore his dignity, but to change how such situations were handled in the future. His story was no longer just personal. It was now a matter of justice for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. On his way home, James felt a growing determination within him. He wasn't going to back down, and now he knew he would do everything possible to achieve justice. He didn't want anyone else to experience what he had endured, to be escorted out of a financial institution simply because of the color of their skin. He was going to tell his story and prove that he deserved respect just as much as anyone else. Laura Miller understood that James's story needed to reach as wide an audience as possible. She knew all too well that incidents of discrimination like his happened time and again, but often went unnoticed, failing to garner public attention. While working on the article, Laura decided to focus not only on the blatant act of discrimination James had faced, but also on the emotional toll, the experience of confronting prejudice daily, and the humiliation of having one's honesty and dignity questioned. She began with a vivid description of James entering the financial institution on the first day, confident, calm, and filled with a sense of accomplishment. She recounted how he was simply ready to deposit the check that represented months of hard work. Laura also detailed how that confidence quickly turned into confusion and anger when Richard Harrison approached and made James feel out of place in a setting where he had every right to be. The scene of James being escorted out under the watchful eyes of the security guard was captured with striking emotional depth, illustrating just how deeply James was hurt. Laura knew that the article couldn't just inform. It had to make readers feel as though it could happen to anyone. Her goal was not merely to recount the facts of discrimination, but to allow readers to empathize with what James had endured in those moments. She wanted to show that this wasn't just one man's story. It was the story of many, and one that demanded attention and action. When the article was finished, Laura published it on a popular online platform with thousands of readers. It began spreading almost immediately. People shared it on social media, commented on it, and expressed their outrage and support for James. The response was swift and powerful. In the comments, there were not only words of encouragement, but also stories from others who had faced similar injustices and discrimination. Readers shared their own experiences of feeling vulnerable and humiliated in situations where they should have been treated with respect. When James read the article, he felt a sense of relief. He knew that his story would no longer remain in the shadows and that he wasn't alone in this fight. He was deeply grateful to Laura for so accurately conveying his emotions and pain. He saw the support pouring in, the many people willing to stand with him in the fight for equality and justice. This gave him the strength and confidence to keep going, knowing he was doing the right thing. Predictably, the article attracted not only public attention, but also that of the financial institution's management. The day after it was published, James received a call from a bank representative. In a polite yet detached tone, they informed him that they were willing to conduct an internal investigation into Richard Harrison's behavior. It was clear that the bank was under pressure and simply trying to mitigate the public backlash, but James understood that these words meant little without concrete action. Even so, the very fact that the bank felt compelled to respond was a victory. It showed that they couldn't ignore what had happened. James knew, however, that real change would require more than just promises of an investigation. He was determined to ensure that the bank couldn't sweep this incident under the rug. Laura understood this too, and was prepared to keep covering the story to ensure James received the justice he deserved. Community members who had seen the article began reaching out to James, offering their support and willingness to help. These were not just friends and acquaintances, but also strangers who were outraged by what had happened. James felt he had gained new allies. He realized that his personal story had become something much larger. It had inspired others to stand up for their rights and refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. When James met with Thomas and Laura that evening to discuss their next steps, he felt that their small group had grown into a real team. They planned to organize a public appeal to the bank's management, draw even more attention to the issue, and push for meaningful changes. James knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, he felt that justice was within reach. Laura suggested holding a demonstration in front of the bank to attract media attention and show that they wouldn't back down. Thomas supported the idea, believing that public pressure was exactly what was needed to compel the institution's leadership to take serious action. James agreed, knowing this wasn't just his fight. It was a fight for the rights of everyone who had ever been demeaned or marginalized. This chapter marked the beginning of James's story growing in scale, transforming from a personal ordeal into a public movement. He was determined to see it through because he knew he wasn't alone this time. He felt the strength of an entire community behind him, people who were also ready for change, who were tired of discrimination and injustice. Now it all depended on their resolve and unity, and James was prepared to go the distance. The day had come for James to return to the financial institution, but this time he wasn't alone. Accompanying him were Thomas, Laura, and several journalists with cameras ready to capture every moment. They hadn't come merely to deposit a check. They were there to prove that dignity and justice must be integral parts of any interaction. This morning was a symbol not just of James's personal struggle, but of the broader fight for the rights of those constantly scrutinized and questioned. As James approached the bank, his heart beat a little faster. He couldn't help but recall the humiliating moments when he had been escorted out by security guards as if he were a threat. But this time, he knew he had support, and that strengthened his resolve. Behind him were journalists, who turned on their cameras as the group neared the entrance. Laura walked beside him, carefully observing the situation, ready to document every detail. The security guard at the entrance tensed up upon seeing them approach. He recognized James, and his eyes widened at the sight of the cameras and group of people. The situation was markedly different from before. James entered with a determined expression, and the atmosphere in the building shifted instantly. Silence fell over the room. Employees looked up, many recognizing him, and the tension in their gazes was palpable. Maria, once again seated at the counter, noticed James and exhaled slightly, her expression a mix of surprise and concern. James walked to the counter, his movements now filled with confidence. He handed the check to Maria, who froze momentarily, her eyes darting between him and Richard Harrison, seated at his desk. Richard, seeing James and the journalists, stiffened visibly. His expression changed. This was no longer a private confrontation. It had become a public spectacle, and every misstep could cost him his reputation. Richard slowly rose and approached the counter. This time the confidence he had previously displayed was absent. He hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. His face maintained a mask of politeness, but his eyes betrayed a simmering hostility. Finally, he addressed James, but his words lacked the arrogance James had heard before. Richard stated that, of course, they would deposit the check, but a standard procedure of verification would need to be followed first. However, everyone in the room knew this was merely an attempt to save face in front of the cameras. Thomas, standing next to James, stepped forward. He knew the situation needed to be handled with complete transparency. With a calm but firm tone, he stated that no additional checks were necessary, as James had already been subjected to them, and the check was entirely legitimate. Thomas's voice was steady, his words leaving no room for argument. Richard paused, his face reddening slightly with tension. He realized he could no longer act as he pleased. The cameras recorded everything, and any display of discrimination would be documented. Maria, once again tasked with processing the check, worked quickly and carefully. She knew she was under scrutiny and couldn't afford to make a mistake. James could feel the tension in the room growing. He noticed how the employees at their desks were covertly watching the scene, some with curiosity, others with surprise. The other customers in the bank turned their attention to the group, trying to understand what was happening. After a short while, Maria finally completed the process and informed James that his check had been successfully deposited. Her face showed relief, and she even allowed herself a small smile as she looked at James. He thanked her, feeling the heavy burden of the past few days beginning to lift. But it wasn't over yet. James turned to Richard and met his eyes. Richard's gaze was filled with restrained anger, and at that moment, James realized this man was still unwilling to admit his mistakes, even now in front of the public. However, James didn't need his acknowledgement. He already knew he had won this battle. His check had been accepted, and his dignity defended. The journalists began peppering Richard with questions, demanding explanations about the previous day's events and the reasons for refusing to serve James. Richard tried to answer as neutrally as possible, his face maintaining a stony expression, but every word he spoke carried an undertone of resentment. James stood with Thomas and Laura observing the scene. He felt that this moment was important not just for him, but for everyone who had faced similar treatment. His story had been heard, and this time his rights could not be ignored. When it was all over, James walked out of the financial institution feeling an inner relief. Outside, he was greeted with applause from a group of activists who had come to support him. Laura smiled, jotting down a few notes in her notebook, and promised to keep covering the story to ensure meaningful change. James nodded in response, knowing that there was still much work to be done. He understood that this was just one part of the fight. Yes, his check had been deposited, and Richard had been forced to comply. But it was crucial to ensure that such incidents wouldn't happen again, that people like him could walk into financial institutions and receive the same services as everyone else, without discrimination or humiliation. James knew he had to keep pushing forward to achieve this goal. This chapter marked a significant step in his fight for justice. It was the day James not only restored his dignity, but also demonstrated that attempts to demean someone based on prejudice and stereotypes could be broken if one refused to stay silent and fought for their rights. And he knew that he would continue moving forward, determined to make the world a fairer and more equal place for everyone. After successfully depositing his check and drawing public attention to the injustice he faced, James realized this was just the beginning. The story Laura published on a popular online platform quickly gained traction. People on social media actively discussed it, shared their own stories of discrimination, and expressed their support for James. Such incidents were far from rare, and now James felt his fight had grown in scale, becoming a symbol for many. Riding the wave of attention, James and his friends decided not to stop there. Laura suggested organizing a rally outside the bank. She wanted the public to hear not only James's story, but also the stories of others who had faced prejudice and discrimination. The idea was simple: to show that James wasn't alone and that these situations were part of a systemic problem, not an isolated incident. James supported the idea. He felt it was his duty to do everything possible to fight not just for himself, but for those without resources or support. He wanted people to know they didn't have to remain silent and that they had the right to demand respectful treatment. He understood that discrimination in financial institutions and other areas of life wasn't just a personal humiliation, but a systemic barrier that prevented many from achieving their goals and accessing the same rights as others. Organizing the rally took several days. James, along with Thomas and Laura, actively worked to raise public awareness through social media, phone calls, and personal outreach. They spread the word about the upcoming rally, inviting people to join them and share their stories. They managed to gather a sizable group of like-minded individuals ready to support the cause. The day of the rally arrived, and as James stood outside the bank, his heart pounded. He was surrounded by people, many holding signs with messages of equality and respect. Some carried photos of loved ones who had also experienced prejudice. The air was filled with tension, but there was also a palpable sense of hope. These were people who believed they could make a difference. Laura and Thomas stood by his side, offering moral support. Laura took on the role of rally coordinator. She gave interviews to journalists who had arrived at the scene, explaining that this rally wasn't just about James, but about everyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider in their own country. She spoke about how prejudice ruins lives and limits opportunities, and how such incidents must be brought to light to effect change. James also addressed the crowd. Taking the microphone, he began to tell his story, recounting every step from the moment he first entered the bank. He described how his confidence turned to humiliation, how his dignity was questioned solely because of the color of his skin. He spoke honestly and openly, and his words resonated deeply with those gathered. Many nodded as they listened, and some couldn't hold back tears, recognizing their own experiences in his story. James urged everyone to demand respect and fair treatment. He called on those present not to be afraid to speak out about their problems, to demand change. He emphasized that only through unity and support could they change a system that had long ignored their rights. His words carried power and determination, and everyone listening could feel the energy behind them. As James spoke, Thomas stood in the background, observing the crowd's reaction. He saw how people were inspired by James's words, how their faces changed, and how a new resolve appeared in their eyes. Thomas understood that they had started something significant. This was more than just a rally. It was a call to action, a call for change. They were building a community of people ready to fight for their rights. After the speeches, rally participants continued to talk with one another, sharing stories and exchanging contact information. Many approached James to thank him for his courage and determination. They shared their own experiences and struggles, and James listened to each of them, feeling that all of this was worth it. He realized his story had become a catalyst for change, giving him a sense of fulfillment and pride. The bank's leadership couldn't ignore what was happening. A few representatives came out to speak with the protesters, attempting to open a dialogue, but their efforts felt insincere, like yet another promise to look into the matter. They offered to meet for discussions and work on improving service. However, James and the others knew that words couldn't replace real actions. They demanded changes, not just apologies or empty promises, but actual reforms to prevent such incidents from happening again. As the rally came to an end, James felt tired, but it was a fulfilling exhaustion. He knew this was just the first step, that much work lay ahead, but he was no longer alone. He saw people around him who were ready to stand with him, who supported him, and fought for their rights just as he did. On his way home, James felt his determination grow stronger. He knew they needed to push for real changes, to ensure that the financial institution revised its internal policies so that similar incidents wouldn't happen again. But he also understood that their fight had already made a difference. They had drawn attention, started a conversation, and that in itself was a significant victory. This chapter demonstrated the limitless power of community. The people who rallied around James became not just witnesses to his struggle, but active participants in the movement for justice. James knew their journey was just beginning, but together they could accomplish great things. He was ready to keep moving forward, knowing that every step he took was backed by hope and the drive for a better future. Several weeks had passed since the rally in front of the bank. James, Laura, and Thomas continued their efforts to keep public attention focused on the issue and to apply pressure on the bank's management. Their work began to bear fruit. In response to the rally and public outrage, the bank's leadership issued an official statement announcing an internal investigation and their intention to review service standards. But James knew that words alone wouldn't change anything. He wanted real action, and together with Thomas and Laura, they devised a plan to push the system toward meaningful reform. Laura leveraged her connections in the journalism community to keep James's story in the news cycle. She interviewed other bank clients who had faced similar issues, uncovered additional examples of discrimination, and wrote articles highlighting the systemic injustice these incidents reflected. She understood the importance of maintaining public pressure so the bank couldn't simply let the matter fade away. One day, James received an invitation to meet with the bank's new manager. This wasn't Richard Harrison, who after the rally and media scrutiny had been reassigned to a less prominent position at another branch. The new manager, Patrick Watson, represented a fresh opportunity for change. While James wasn't expecting swift radical reforms, he decided to give the meeting a chance. When James entered Patrick's office, he was greeted with restrained but polite professionalism. Patrick, a man in his mid-40s with a straight posture and a slightly fatigued expression, looked like someone who had been grappling with significant challenges in recent weeks. James noticed posters in the office promoting diversity and inclusion. While they might have been symbolic gestures, he hoped that at least some of the words on those posters would translate into real actions. Patrick began the meeting with an apology. He expressed regret for the discrimination James had faced in their institution, acknowledging the incident as unacceptable. He promised that they were working on changes to ensure such occurrences would not happen again. James listened carefully, but he also knew that words were just words unless backed by action. When Patrick proposed revisiting the bank's internal procedures, James saw an opening. Together with Thomas, who accompanied him to the meeting, they outlined concrete proposals. First, they demanded mandatory cultural sensitivity and anti-bias training for all bank employees. James knew that many such incidents occurred because people were unaware of their own prejudices, and training could help address this issue. Second, James and Thomas insisted on implementing a transparent system for handling customer complaints, ensuring prompt and impartial investigations of any allegations of discrimination. James knew that without media attention, his case could have gone unnoticed. A reliable system was essential to protect customers' rights and resolve incidents fairly without requiring public intervention. Patrick listened attentively and took notes. He assured James and Thomas that the bank was committed to making changes and would start by implementing their recommendations immediately. He also invited James to serve as a consultant in designing a new customer interaction protocol, so his experience could help improve service for all clients, regardless of their background or race. These words came as a surprise to James. He hadn't expected to be asked to participate in systemic changes. Although he was initially unsure whether to accept the offer, he recognized it as an opportunity to effect meaningful change. After a brief moment of reflection, he agreed, but with one condition, that his proposals would be taken seriously and that the bank's commitment to action would go beyond appearances. After the meeting, James and Thomas left the bank, and James felt a sense of mild relief. It wasn't a victory, but it was an important step in the right direction. They knew the road ahead would be long, but now they had a chance to influence the system from within, and James was ready to seize the opportunity. Returning home, James shared the news with Laura. She was thrilled to hear that the bank had taken tangible steps, and that James had been invited to help shape new policies. She immediately began planning a new article to share the updates with the public and to maintain pressure on the bank's leadership until the changes were fully implemented. James also understood that a great deal of work lay ahead. He knew that one meeting with the new manager was only the beginning of a lengthy process and that real change would take time, but he was prepared for it. He knew his fight wasn't just about his own dignity, but about creating a system where every client could feel equal and respected. This chapter marked a pivotal moment in James's journey, an opportunity to influence the system from within. He was determined to do everything in his power to ensure that this case became the starting point for genuine reform. He understood that the path would be long, but now he carried not only his personal experience, but also the support of countless people who were ready to fight for equality and justice. Several months had passed since James agreed to help reform the bank's customer interaction system. These months were challenging, filled with intense work and countless meetings, but James felt that progress was being made. The bank's leadership had realized that public scrutiny wasn't waning, and they were now compelled to follow through on their promises and implement the changes they had publicly announced. James attended internal meetings, collaborated with consultants, and participated in drafting new service standards. At first, it all seemed distant from real change, corporate activities designed to create the illusion of progress, but gradually he began to notice genuine shifts. The leadership started taking his proposals seriously. Employees underwent cultural sensitivity training, and new customer service protocols were rolled out across the bank's branches. One of the most significant moments came when Patrick Watson invited James to hold an open forum with the bank's staff. This event was meant to allow employees to hear firsthand how bias could erode customer trust and harm the institution's reputation. James knew he would be addressing people who might have never considered their behavior problematic or viewed bias as a real issue. When he entered the large conference hall filled with dozens of employees, he felt many eyes on him, curious, wary, and even resentful. He knew his words might make some uncomfortable, but that was precisely the point. James began by sharing his story, reliving the day when he faced Richard Harrison and the humiliation of having his right to access banking services questioned. He described every emotion, every moment of indignity, as he was escorted out of the bank as though he had done something wrong. James's tone was not accusatory. His words were calm and measured, but his determination was unmistakable. He spoke about how bias infiltrates daily life, often unnoticed, limiting opportunities and making people doubt their worth. He talked not just about his own story, but about how such incidents could happen to anyone. For most people, a bank represents security and trust, but for some, it can become a place of humiliation and distrust. After his speech, there was a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. The room absorbed the weight of his words. Slowly, hands began to rise. One young employee admitted he had never considered how his behavior might be perceived as biased and thanked James for his candor. Others acknowledged that the system indeed needed to change to prevent such incidents from happening again. This forum marked a turning point. James felt he had finally reached the people working within the system and influenced their perspectives. Following the event, employees began treating him with greater respect. He no longer felt like an outsider in those walls. He was seen as an equal and as someone who had helped make the bank a better institution. A symbolic moment came when Patrick Watson himself agreed to undergo the same training as the rest of the staff, demonstrating that change had to start at the top. Patrick understood that his role was not only to manage the process, but also to set an example for others. James knew real change would take time. He continued to contribute to the development of new training programs, working closely with Laura and Thomas to keep public attention on the issue of discrimination. He understood that his work wouldn't end with this bank. Thanks to Laura's article and their public advocacy, James's story had become an example for other banks and financial institutions. People began reaching out to them, sharing similar experiences and seeking help and guidance. One evening, after a long day of meetings and discussions, James received a call from Laura. She told him their efforts had led to another major milestone. The industry's leadership had begun working on a new program aimed at combating discrimination in financial institutions. Laura's voice was full of enthusiasm, and James felt their hard work was paying off. The final chapter of this journey came when James found himself once again standing at the doors of the same bank where it all began. This time, however, he was not there as a customer, but as an honored guest at a ceremony launching the new anti-discrimination program. He stood outside recalling the first day he was humiliated and escorted out, and realized how far he had come, not just back to this building, but into a role where he could inspire and create meaningful change. As he entered the bank, he was greeted with respect. People who once looked at him with suspicion now smiled and welcomed him. Patrick Watson introduced James to the audience as one of the key figures who had made these changes possible. James delivered a short speech, emphasizing that real change takes time and starts with acknowledging biases and committing to transformation. After the event, James felt an incredible sense of relief and accomplishment. He knew there were still many challenges ahead, that discrimination wouldn't disappear overnight, but he also knew he had done everything he could to spark the process of change. Standing on the bank's threshold, looking at the people around him, he understood that his fight had not been in vain. He had managed to transform not only the bank, but also the lives of many others. Laura and Thomas joined him, standing by his side as they watched the event unfold. Laura smiled and said they had only just begun, that there was still much work to do. Thomas nodded in agreement. James, looking at his friends, realized he wasn't alone, and that together they could achieve even more. This story ended not just with James's victory, but with the beginning of broader societal change. It became an example of how unity, resilience, and determination could transform a system that had long ignored the rights of individuals. James knew that the fight for equality would never be completely over, but now he believed that every step forward mattered.